All right, and welcome back. It's been a little while since we sat and had a discussion about the history of theater, and what we are going to start today is our discussion on musical theater. However, before we get too deep into the origins and the evolution of the American musical, what we need to do first is take a look at some of the nuts and bolts, some of the vocabulary that we are going to be encountering as we study the musical, and some of the different types of musicals that we are going to be taking a look at. So, first things first, let's get the first definition out of the way. What is a musical? Well, we're going to find that definition has changed significantly from its early days to what we know now, but in a modern sense, a musical is any theatrical endeavor wherein the songs that are featured are sung by the actors naturally, so it's not background music or incidental music. It is sung by the performers, and theoretically, those songs help tell the story. They help communicate the emotional journey that the characters are going through to the audience. So one of the first things we have to ask ourselves is, though, so what is the difference between a musical and the other form of musical theater, which we've already talked about, the opera? Well, the main difference is, of course, that the musical features dialogue. The music works with the dialogue, with the written word to help tell the story. Again, a general rule of thumb when writing a musical is that you bring the songs in whenever the characters are experiencing an emotion so strong that simply saying, "Hey, I feel this way," won't cut it. They need to express that emotion in a much larger way. So the music, the singing, and the dancing work with the dialogue. Now compare this to the opera, wherein the music is all-consuming. Again, operas were, I'd say, 99% sung. In a very rare instance, you'd have one or two lines of spoken dialogue, but all of the emotion in the opera is communicated via the music. So that's the main difference, but it's not the only difference. There are a couple of other little things that set the musical apart from its parent, the opera. One of those other instances is that a musical can incorporate a wide range of musical genres. There are musicals that feature classical singing. There are musicals that feature rock and roll. There are musicals that feature hip-hop and R&B. So the musical can incorporate a variety of musical genres. The opera is pretty set. It employs operatic music. You don't find a lot of rock operas. I mean, that is a term, but you find that's normally used to describe a certain type of musical as opposed to a classical opera. One of the other big points is that a musical is usually, again, this is a blanket statement, but a musical is usually presented in the language of the audience. So let's say you take one of our musicals, something like, let's say Fiddler on the Roof, and if you were to take that show and have it performed, say, in Japan, the dialogue would be translated into Japanese for that audience. You very rarely would have people go and see a musical where the characters are acting and singing in a language that they don't understand. Now compare that to an opera where, of course, it's always going to be in the language that it's written in. That's just the way it is. So these are some small examples, but we see very clearly the musical and the opera are two very, very different entities. However, when they began, they started a lot closer together. So what we want to do here today is let's take a look at the different types of musicals that we're going to be encountering throughout our journey into the history of musical theater. So, as mentioned a moment ago, the modern day musical and the classical opera are two very, very different artistic styles. However, when the musical first began, it had much more in common with the classical opera than it does now. And the thing that kind of bridges the gap between these two art forms is a third genre kind of in the middle, which is called an operetta. Operettas were smaller versions of classical operas. They were shorter, the subject matter usually lighter. They would include more spoken dialogue, even though they were still communicated primarily through song, but they would still have a few dialogue scenes to kind of bridge the gaps. And they would also incorporate dance into the storytelling. This is something that the classical operas very rarely did. But with the operetta, dance became a vital part of the entertainment. Probably the two most famous creators of operettas were the team of Gilbert and Sullivan, who crafted some of the most famous examples, including the HMS Pinafore. So these shorter, lighter, more dialogue inclusive, and dance featuring operettas would serve as the stepping stone to the creation of the American musical. After the operetta, the next type of musical that we need to be familiar with is called a revue. Revues would be the form that the musical would take for the first several decades of its existence. The best way to describe a revue in modern terms is think of it like a talent show. It wasn't simply a musical performance, but rather producers would gather up the very best performers from all over and bring them all together for one night of entertainment. So you would have singers, you would have dancers, you've had jugglers, you would have comedians, you would have novelty acts, all under one roof. The revue very rarely had any kind of storyline. If it did, it was a very, very thin one. Just a little through line to maybe link the acts together. But generally speaking, the revues were just a hodgepodge of different acts all thrown together. Very rarely would they include original music, but rather they would find the most popular songs and performers from other shows and bring them into their revue. We're going to talk about some of the most famous and influential revues a little later on. Coming after the revues, we see the creation of what would become called the book musical, or the situation musical, as some composers would call it. A book musical refers to any musical where there is actually a story, something that links the different songs and dance numbers together. Now, it's important to understand that in the early days of the book musical, the songs and the stories were almost completely separate. The songs were written to stand on their own and be sold independently of the show itself. So you would just have a kind of generic love song that you could then pull out of the show, sell that song independently, and people could listen to it at home. As theater evolves, the book musical would eventually evolve into what we would now call the integrated musical. In an integrated musical, the songs and dance numbers are designed to help influence the story. They are there to specifically act as part of the larger narrative, therefore making it a little bit more difficult to pull the song out of the situation of the musical. So you have the original book musical, and then it would eventually become the integrated musical. Today, we would call the integrated musical just the book musical. In the 60s and 70s, when theater began to become more experimental, we would eventually see the creation of a new type of musical, this one called the concept musical. A concept musical is any musical where the emphasis is placed upon the style, the message, or the thematic metaphor rather than on the plot itself. Concept musicals very rarely adhered to what we would consider a modern storytelling structure. They were not necessarily told linearly. It's okay if this doesn't make a lot of sense to you right now. We will go into much more detail of the concept musical a little way down the road. Just have this in the back of your mind that a concept musical emphasizes the style, message, and thematic metaphor rather than the plot. Around the 80s and 90s, we saw the evolution of yet another type of musical, this one called the jukebox musical. The jukebox musical actually has more in common with the early days of the book musical than it does with anything else. In a jukebox musical, the authors would take existing music, songs that were already popular or already released by another artist, and then try to write a story around them. So in this instance, instead of writing songs for the show or writing songs that are specific to the emotional journey of the characters, here you find popular songs that people already know and then attempt to write a story that links them all together. Mamma Mia is probably the most famous example of this using ABBA songs. There's also Rock of Ages, which centers around using hair metal band music from the 1980s. A lot of times what this genre of musical will be used for is to tell the life story of a specific artist using their big hits as kind of bookmarks in time. For instance, the musical Jersey Boys is about the life and career of the musical group Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, and it uses Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons music to emphasize the journey through time. Jukebox musicals are very popular, but they are a little problematic because it is the very definition of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You are trying to make songs that either don't have a narrative connected to them or have a completely different narrative connected to them fit into this new story. So I tend to find that the results for a jukebox musical can be very hit and miss. Regardless of the type of musical that we are looking at, we are going to find that there are three specific roles in writing a musical, and we're going to hear these terms over and over and over again. So let's make sure we understand what they mean. First, you have the composer. This is the person who writes the music, and just the music. Second, you have the lyricist. This is the person who obviously writes the lyrics. In most instances that we're going to cover, a lot of musicals are written by a team, a composer and a lyricist. One person who writes the music and one person who writes the lyrics. We are going to see several examples, however, of people who did both. The other component is the person who wrote the book. This obviously means who wrote the script. So, unlike a common play where one person is responsible for the entire creative output, with a musical, it is usually divided into at least two parts and sometimes three. One to write the music, one to write the lyrics, and one to write the book.